I think adolescence for me was the time when my life kind of went off track, and it does for a lot of people. When I say off track, I think actually off track for poems is much more interesting than on track, and I tend to look for the off track times. A poet who's a friend of mine just said to me recently, when I'm reading a biography of a person, I'm not interested in the facts that are there. I'm interested in the 5 missing years or the things that aren't there. I think family is the most authentic and sometimes troubling and sometimes wonderful relationships and subjects for poems that there are. And so I've written about my mother. My mother's death prompted a number of poems. I've written a lot of poems about my family cottage in Michigan, which I continue to write about all the time. It's been there my whole life, and so it's very important to me. I've written a lot of poems about my brother. I had a retarded brother who was part of our family until he died when he was 25. Poems about family are very rich poems often, and very true poems often if they spend the time to go into the areas they need to, and sometimes those areas are very dark and sometimes they're not. A poem is not therapy. Those two things are really very different, and often I get into areas in poems that are painful areas, but because I'm working with a poem and I'm making art out of it, which is a whole other thing. It often is therapeutic. D.H. Lawrence, the novelist and poet, said we work out our sickness in books, and it is true that it ends up being therapeutic, but it's not. If the therapy of the poem is the point of the poem, then it doesn't turn out to be a poem. It has to be out there as an object separate from you, and actually that's what does heal finally, I think. It's moving it out away from you and making it into an object. A poem isn't quite like a painting. You look at a painting and there's color on the page, you hear music and there are sounds, and those things are nonverbal. And so it is possible for you to take those and make them into anything you want to. A poem actually, though, is made of words on a page, and words have meanings that are specific, that are in the dictionary. First of all, I think it's important to read a poem not as a narcissist, to read it as whatever the person wrote the poem meant to do. You have to be inside the poem before you go inside your own head. You have to climb into the words of the poem and into the meaning of the poem and be there first. And then you can begin to relate it to yourself or your life. Sometimes I don't get a poem and I think it's because the poet didn't do enough to help me. I think a poet has to provide enough rocks so that you can jump across the stream, but the rocks can't be so far apart that you fall in. You've got to keep meaning there enough so that, and you have to keep some kind of sense of the world that we live in there enough to get from place to place in the poem. Every poet fears criticism in some way because we never really can be absolutely sure that what we have is working as well as we'd like it to, or as well as we think it might be. It's very hard when you've worked hard for years on a book and you get a review by somebody who doesn't understand your book and who has things to say that obviously show that the book isn't clearly understood. But on the other hand, it's very wonderful when somebody reads the book you've been working on for 5 years and finds wonderful things to say about it. Even Emily Dickinson, who wrapped all her poems in ribbons and put them in a drawer her entire life, wanted very much to be published. She tried over and over again, but the work that she was writing was so radically different from the work being published at the time that she got nothing but rebuffs almost all the time. She had only a very few poems appear anywhere. She had to have confidence in what she was doing. Now, obviously, she had ended up putting it in a drawer, and lots of people do. But the important thing is to keep in contact and in conversation with what's going on out there in the world, even if it's not working for you at the moment to get those things published. You need to pay attention. Your work might be miles and miles ahead of the culture at the time, like Emily Dickinson's. You have to be dogged in keeping on no matter what people say, because you have to trust the work you're doing and hope that at some point somebody recognizes the good points of your work. What inspires me as a poet is whatever happens to be around at the time. I'm not sure that inspiration is really an issue. People get inspired all the time by all sorts of things, but they don't necessarily write those down. So when I sit down to write, I'm not sitting down because some kind of mystical force put me in a chair and inspired me. I sit down to write because there's an idea that I want to play around with or an image I want to play around with. And the longer I work with it, gradually, I hope if I get halfway through a draft, I begin to get inspired. I begin to feel energy coming from that material. And if I don't begin to feel energy coming from that material, then I finally need to dump it and move on to something else. The writing process for me usually starts with prose. I don't start writing on a computer. A lot of people I know do, but I start writing with a pencil and paper. Miscellaneous feelings and images around some idea. And then I begin to pull out of that interesting pieces and see what I can do with those interesting pieces. But I don't move to the computer until it feels like it's going somewhere, and I'm pretty confident of that. Because once I see it on a screen with print, it kind of feels a little bit more fixed, and somehow my mind tightens down on it a little bit more. And I think it's better to stay loose with it for as long as I can. First, read all you can get your hands on. Read poetry from a long time ago and read contemporary poetry. Read all over the place. And pay attention to what you're reading very, very closely. Notice how poems are put together. Don't just read and enjoy, but read and study the structure of the poem. Look how it manages to do for you what it does. And then write an awful lot. Write all the time, as much as you possibly can. And make sure at some point that you sit down with a professional poet, somebody who's publishing professionally, and work with that person and see what kind of advice you get, and try more than one person, work with several people, and see if that can boost what you're doing a little bit. Sometimes advice from friends is wonderful, but sometimes friends are extremely praising, and you may need a little push. The German poet Rilke is a poet that I turn to all the time when I want to be sort of called up short as a poet and to realize what real poetry can do. I like 19th century poets. I like Browning. I like the Romantics. I like Wordsworth and Shelley. And I read everybody. A lot of contemporary poets I'm very interested in. I like Louise Gluck. I like Linda Gregg. I like Mary Oliver. I like James Wright, Larry Levis. Galway Canal, Linda Paston. I read Brenda Hillman. Those are two real extremes. I read Jory Graham. I read Richard Wilbur, W.D. Snodgrass, Phil Levine, who just picked my last book, especially like him. There are an awful lot of poets writing. This is a good time for poetry. There are many, many good poets.